Now, before I discuss Roosevelt's treachery and deceit in terms of our supposed neutrality before the belligerents, I think it's important to address the utilitarian argument that Germany and Japan posed a serious threat to the United States. That we would, I mean, the story that is given, because it's acknowledged that Roosevelt was not acting very neutrally and whatever, but it's then usually addended that, well, he had a lot of foresight and he understood the great evil that we were up against, and so we should forgive his treachery. And of course, this is actually the line by the man Robert Stinnett, who wrote the book on his treachery, at least in terms of Pearl Harbor, The Day of Deceit. He says, well, he needed to do it because Nazi Germany especially was so evil and so threatening. Now, logically there's one real glaring problem with this, and that is, of course, our number one ally, not our number one, but our ally in World War II is, of course, the USSR, which is by any measure worse than either Japan or Germany. So it doesn't even make the picking of the lesser of two evils. But the other problem here is that neither Germany nor Japan, nor a combination of the two, ever posed a threat to the United States, and it is only theoretically, but very unlikely, that they ever could have. Is it theoretically possible that they could have conquered all of Eurasia? Yes. That's almost impossible, and even if they had, it's an open question whether that would have translated into them even wanting to invade us or even having the ability to do so. Now, I'm going to come off the bat and say, even though I read a lot about World War II, I know much, much more about Germany than I do about Japan. And I'll say that as far as anyone I've ever read, all the contemporaries especially, I mean, if you look at it today, this isn't so clear. Germany and Japan, they're just the main enemies, and everyone understands that Italy and Finland and Romania and Hungary are lesser enemies. And of course, everyone forgets that the USSR was allied to Germany for 2 years. However, at the time, it was also widely understood that actually between Germany and Japan, Germany was by far the stronger of the two. They were much more formidable enemy than Japan was, and I wonder how fair this would be. But to give you some idea, before the war started, the U.S. military had already decided how they were going to fight the war, and they had scheduled that about 85% of the resources that they could muster would be sent to fight Germany, and 15% would be sent to fight Japan. Now, that's not to say that they thought that was the ratio of their strength, but that they wanted to take care of Germany first, and the 15% on Japan was just to hold them at bay. And as it turned out, it wasn't that ratio, because since Japan attacked us, that was where the real political will to fight was, and it was a hard sell. They did go to Germany first anyway, but it was a hard sell to say, well, we're just not going to pay attention to Japan until Germany's defeated. But recently, there's been a lot of good research and good of revisionist history books basically saying that Germany is considerably weaker than the popular imagination usually imagines. We're usually presented with the idea that Germany is some unstoppable juggernaut, a superpower. And while it is true that the German military was exceptionally good, very well trained, it was superbly led, better than any other military in World War II, I would have no hesitation in saying your average German unit is far the superior of the average unit in any other country. You want to say, well, what about the best paratrooper unit? And yeah, there's that, but and it's well known, though, that they were materially at a huge disadvantage, and they were not on the cusp of world domination. And I could source a number of things here, but I guess the one I'll cite the most is after the war, all the countries involved, all the governments involved, commissioned basically what they considered definitive works on their country's role in the conflict. The USSR's is like 170 volumes long. The Americans is similarly long. Germans did not write one for a long time because they felt bad or whatever, and Holocaust guilt. They finally got around to doing it in the 80s, and the volumes kind of came out in the 90s. And when I was in college, I was walking through my library and I saw them. I wasn't looking for them in particular. I said, what are these thick books? The one they wrote, it's called Germany and the Second World War. It's 10 volumes long, and at least 2 of the volumes are double volumes. So it's at least 12 books long, and each one more than 1,000 pages. Now, I never read the whole thing, but I did read the first 5 volumes, which is enough to cover what I'm going to talk about here. And it's very explicit that Germany was not militarily powerful enough to assert itself over basically all of Europe, let alone all of Eurasia. In the popular imagination, the war was up in the air. Depending on who you ask, the battle people usually pick is Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 going to 43. Obviously, the German army reached Stalingrad, I believe, in August of 1942. There was a Soviet counterattack in November. The 6th Army was surrounded by a week or two before Christmas, and the last units surrendered on February 1st, although the chances that they would be rescued were eliminated by around New Year's. And people usually cite this as the turning point. I would say that the point at which Germany could not win the war is much earlier than this. In fact, I would say it's before they even attacked the Soviet Union. I would place it at the Battle of Britain, actually. The Battle of Britain's famous battle after the fall of France. The Germans decided that they were going to invade Great Britain, and of course the British had lost a lot of equipment during the spring offensive that year that they had on the continent. They weren't able to get much of it back. There had been big defeats, and if you read a different source than I mentioned, Lost Victories, this is by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably one of the best commanders the Germans had in World War II, up there with Rundstedt. I'd say he's the only one that they would actually compare. Or Guderian, maybe too. He thinks that if they had actually invaded Great Britain like that week, it might have happened, but that's speculation. I actually disagree with him. Okay, it's hindsight. What do I know compared to him? I do actually know some things that he didn't know. The famous story here is that Hitler said, okay, we will invade England, but we can't do it until we destroy the Royal Air Force, because if we attempt to have barges across the English Channel and there are Spitfires strafing them and Hurricanes strafing them, it'll never work. And I actually agree with him here. And so he said the Luftwaffe must gain not air parity, air superiority over southeast England. And so they would launch, that's what the whole Battle of Britain was about, that Luftwaffe would launch planes to bomb British air factories, British airways, to try to destroy British planes. And this was an intense battle. However, and at the start of it, the Luftwaffe had more planes, probably at least equally qualified, maybe even slightly better pilots. However, they were fighting at the disadvantage of fighting over home turf, which meant they didn't have as much gas. And the other thing was, and this is something that Manstein didn't know and that the Germans didn't know, and this is why I feel like I'm right and he's wrong, you can debate, is that the German aircraft industry at that time had double the monthly aircraft production that the Germans thought that it did. And this meant that the war of attrition that was supposed to destroy the RAF was very likely doomed to fail, as indeed it did. And when it did, and this opportunity was lost, and even he will admit that the opportunity was only with like a month, and then by that time they would have regrouped enough that even without the RAF, German troops attempting to cross the channel would have been massacred in such numbers that it just never would have panned out. Now, this put Germany in a position where they could not defeat the UK. Again, there's speculation here. One might say, well, the submarine war, if they had known 10 years in advance that that was what was going to happen, maybe. As it happened, prior to World War II, it was actually believed that submarines would not be effective because of advances that were made in sonar. And actually, during World War II, there were advances made in sonar that maybe made that finally come true. However, at the start of the war, that wasn't really the case yet. As it was, though, they only had about a dozen U-boats, and when you're already committed to a land war, you can't just suddenly say, well, let's make hundreds of U-boats. When their air force is stretched thin, when their army is stretched thin, they have to make tanks and they have to make planes. And they can't just... I mean, in all the years I've studied World War II, you always come across, well, why did they just... If they only had more Tiger tanks, and they only had more ME-109s, and they only had more Messerschmitts, and they only had more battleships, and they only had more... That's the thing, is they had limits to what they can make. Obviously, they could inflate as much... the Deutschmark as much as they wanted, but that does not create copper or zinc or steel or the labor hours that it requires to build that stuff. And they had enormous limits that placed on what they could produce. And for them to actually succeed in starving England, possible, but actually, to be honest, they figured how much tonnage they would have to sink every month, and they'd have to do it for a year or 6 months, and there wasn't even a single month in the entire war that they ever got that much. I think the worst months, there were some really bad ones right after the United States joined the war, and one or two earlier, and even they fell by only half. And so, at this point, and bear in mind, the order to build what they were building, many of their resources were coming from the USSR. That was part of the agreement that they signed with Molotov in August of '39, is that other than carving up Poland and having the Russians do more than half of it actually, and the Baltic and parts of Romania, Bukovina, I forget the area in Romania, they went to the Soviets. The Soviets would give the Germans grain, oil, iron, all the goods that they needed. And so you had a situation where in order for the Germans to fight, continue to fight, they would essentially become wholly dependent on the USSR. So not a situation when they're ready to launch an assault on North America. They can't even cross the English Channel. I don't know how people get this idea that, people in Michigan were going to need their rifles. So that's not to say England was in a great position, but they weren't in a position to be defeated, and they actually had the power to outlast the Germans. The British had an empire. They were not going to run out of supplies to keep their factories going, whereas the Germans were. They were always facing bottlenecks. That's why they weren't producing everything that they needed. And so all this is to say that the menace of Nazi Germany, despite its obvious evil, is greatly exaggerated.